Gleich kommt das Falterradio. Vorher gibt es noch Werbung. Sie hilft, unsere journalistische Arbeit zu finanzieren.
Der Preis für ein gutes Buch sollte nicht das gute Gewissen sein. Faltershop.at, der Online-Shop mit Prinzipien. Über 1,5 Millionen Bücher, DVDs und CDs mit gutem Gewissen bestellen.
Falterradio, der Podcast mit Raimund Löw.
Sehr herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum Falterradio für Samstag, den 13.07.2019. Welche Utopien braucht die Linke, um aus ihrer aktuellen Defensivsituation herauszukommen? Die Frage bewegt Menschen in Europa und in den USA, für die Gerechtigkeit in der Gesellschaft ein vordringliches Anliegen ist. Die Wiener Vorlesungen, seit langem schon ein Ort der geistigen Auseinandersetzung, haben sich dem Thema mit führenden Intellektuellen aus Europa und Amerika gewidmet. Utopien für Realisten lautet der Titel des jüngsten Bestsellers, den der niederländische Historiker Rutger Bregman vorlegt. Bregman diskutiert seine umstrittenen Thesen vom zukünftigen 15-Stunden-Tag samt Grundeinkommen für alle in einer Runde von Ökonomen und Historikern. Mit dabei ist in den Wiener Vorlesungen die Ungleichheitsforscherin Miriam Rehm, der Ökonom Armon Rezai und der Historiker Snyder. Die Leitung der Debatte in englischer Sprache hat Ö1-Journalistin Birgit Dahlheimer. Rutger Bregman, der Historiker und Buchautor aus den Niederlanden, hat seine Präsentation bei den Wiener Vorlesungen unkonventionell begonnen.
Now, the first thing I want to do is sort of to measure your intellectual level so that I can adjust my speech if that's necessary. And I'm going to do that with one very simple question, which is, who follows the news? Please raise your hand if you follow the news. Okay. That is a bit depressing. I'll choose the easy version then. Do people read newspapers here as well? Newspapers? Yeah? Okay. Do you watch television? Yeah? So, who has the feeling that he or she is completely brainwashed and has developed an utterly twisted view of the past 200,000 years of human history and knows absolutely nothing about human nature? Does anyone have that feeling? Okay, this is a really good... It's good that some people actually know what's going on. I want to start with the news because the news is probably the worst source of information out there, right? It's always about things that happen today instead of about things that happen every day. It's about the exceptions, right? Mostly about things that go wrong. Corruption, about violence, about terrorism. So if you watch a lot of the news, as you just all admitted you're all doing, at the end of the day, you know exactly how the world doesn't work, right? Because you're only hearing about all these exceptions. To give you an example, here's some recent research by a team of Dutch sociologists where they looked at plane crashes. So what do we see? We see the amount of plane crashes actually going down, because planes become safer. And what do you see with media attention? There's more and more attention for plane crashes. So this is what happens all the time. People become more afraid to step into planes that are actually safer. Another paper by a team of sociologists looked at the same phenomenon, but then when it comes to immigration and crime, and they found the same pattern, you know? The less immigration you have, the more media attention. The less criminal immigrants you have, the more media attention. So the conclusion of these researchers was that there seems to be none or even a negative relationship between news and reality. And you're all consuming it, so something's going terribly wrong here. Now, one of the things that you don't know if you watch a lot of news is that actually there's a lot of good news. If you look at the world, zoom out a little bit, look at it from a world historical perspective, the past 30 years, you could argue have been the best in all of human history. You know, there are so many things that are better nowadays. So if you just look at something like poverty, this is a graph that shows you the decline of extreme poverty. Very difficult, obviously, to estimate, but according to our historians and economists' best estimates, around 84% of the world population lived in extreme poverty in 1820, and that has now declined under 10%. So extraordinary world historic progress. For the past 25 years, there could have been a headline on the front page of the newspaper that said, today, 125,000 people were lifted out of poverty. It could have been a headline every single day for the past 25 years. But you don't see that because it's happening every day instead of today. The other thing is health. What you see here is the vaccination rate. Just around 1980, around 20% of the world population was vaccinated against, say, a terrible disease like measles. Now that's over 80%. And if you look at war victims, this is from the Oslo Peace Research Institute, where you see the extraordinary decline of war deaths globally. Obviously, there are still terrible wars going on. We all know about the horrible stuff from that's been happening and still happens in Syria. But if you zoom out a little bit, what you actually see is a decline in war deaths of 90% since 1946. We are living in the safest period of all of world history. Also, if you look at homicides, the homicide rate in Europe declined by about 40 times since the Middle Ages. So, there are still things that you have to be afraid of. I'm not sure if anyone's married here. Please raise your hand if you're married. Okay, that's that's incredibly dangerous. Around a third of all homicides are committed within, romantic marriages. Well, you should be afraid if you're a man, then it's fine, right? Because all these violence is committed by men. So as long as you don't marry a guy, then it's fine. And the other thing that should be on the front page every day, but in fact is not, is obviously the most terrible news, which is the huge increase in carbon emissions because all these wonderful graphs, that the optimists can show you about declining extreme poverty, better health, etc. They all correlate with this graph of a huge increase in carbon emissions. And now we know that in the past 30 years we emitted half of all our emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So we now have one generation left to fix the problem, and it's quite a radical challenge. I don't think many people really understand just how radical it is. Nowadays, more and more people are talking about the basic fact that we need sort of a World War II style mobilization, do something that has never been done before in peacetime, to move to a zero emissions economy in 2050. It's an era where I think radicalism is the new realism. It's just simply irresponsible to be a moderate nowadays because we can't fix our challenges with just tinkering a little bit around the edges. We need to think in a much, much bigger way. Now, the thing you have to know is that I published this book, Utopia for Realists, quite a while ago, actually already 5 years ago. And back then, my feeling was that the biggest problem of today was not so much that we don't have it good, but that we don't really know where to go next, right? What we do know is that looking at history is that every milestone of civilization, the end of slavery, democracy, equal rights for men and women, they were all utopian fantasies once. And the question I was simply asking back then was, what's next? What's the utopia of today? Do we still have a grand vision of something where we want to go? But now, much more so than 5 years ago, I also realized that actually it's simply an obligation. It's a necessity. It's not just out of boredom that we need utopia, because that's one good reason. It's that technocracy is just boring. But it's also out of necessity that we completely need to reinvent our current way of living. So we need basically, I think, two things. A new image of human nature, because this is never going to happen if you believe that all people are selfish and corrupt and are only in it for themselves, which is something, by the way, that you tend to believe if you follow a lot of the news, right? Which makes you cynical, makes you more depressed. It's an incredibly dangerous drug if you look at it in that way. But the other thing we need is this new vision of utopia, of a radically different kind of society. Now, that's what I want to look at right now. Does anyone know this guy? Who is it? Keynes, yeah, exactly. Wonderful mustache. John Maynard Keynes, probably the most famous economist of the 20th century, British economist. In 1930, he wrote a very famous essay that is called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. It's just 8 pages long or something. You can just Google it and find the PDF. I really recommend that you read it because it makes for some fascinating reading. It was an essay that was basically about our time. So he made 2 predictions for the year 2030, 100 years later. And the first prediction of Keynes was that we would become a lot richer, right? That we would have a lot of innovation, economic growth, that the robots would come, we would see a lot of automation, and that, because of that, we would be about 4 to 8 times as rich. And this part of Keynes' prediction turned out to be true, actually. So nowadays, we're, I think, about 5 times as rich as we were in 1930. So that part of the prediction was quite good. His second prediction was that we would use that wealth, all that economic growth, all that innovation, all these robots coming in, doing the work for us, that we would use it to start working less and less and less and less, and that the work week would steadily keep shrinking. This was something that had been happening since the 1850s, when we still had like 70-hour work weeks, and around Keynes' time it was on average like 50-hour work weeks. But he just extrapolated into the future, and he predicted that we would have a working week in 2030 of just 15 hours. Wonderful, right? Now, you might say, okay, the Keynes, well, crazy guy. Never really liked him anyway, apart from his mustache. And, it's a crazy socialist guy. The interesting thing is actually, if you look at sort of the intellectual zeitgeist, up until the 70s, almost all the experts believed that we would be working less and less and less. All the philosophers and sociologists, they were all writing about the greatest challenge of the future, which was going to be boredom, right? So you had this essay written by Isaac Asimov in the 50s, the great science fiction writer. He was asked by the New York Times, can you take a look at the future 50 years from now? And indeed, he said the biggest challenge was going to be boredom. And the biggest profession was going to be like the psychiatrists, because they would have to treat us, poor people who are suffering from the symptoms of boredom and don't know what to do with their lives, now that the robots have taken all our jobs and there's nothing left to do, and the economic problem has been solved. Turns out that, yes, today it's true that psychiatry has become a huge profession, but for somewhat different reasons. It's mainly treating people who are suffering from burnouts and stress and work-related depression. So it's something went terribly, terribly wrong here. And the question that fascinates me is, what went wrong? How could this happen? How could such a smart man and so many other intellectuals of the time get it so terribly wrong? Usually, there are 2 explanations, right? So the first explanation is the one you're probably familiar with, and it's called consumerism. Consumerism is this thing where you keep on buying stuff you don't really need, to buy, all that stuff and impress people you don't really like, right? That's consumerism. And for a long time, I thought, yeah, that must be it, right? This is probably the explanation, because just look around you. There's just so much crap. There's so much plastic nonsense that we buy. This is probably it. If we would only stop doing that, if we just get rid of all this consumerism, then we can have this 15-hour work week, which sounds terrific. And then I stumbled upon an essay by an American anthropologist, which is, I think, one of the most interesting thinkers of our time. His name is David Graeber. And he wrote an essay with the following title, and very academic title. It's called On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs. Another thing that I would really recommend that you read, it's just, again, like 8 or 9 pages long. And the observation that Graeber makes is that if you think about who produces all that stuff that we consume, all that plastic crap that we don't need to impress people we don't like, who actually produces it? Well, third world wage slaves, right? In, I don't know, Bangladesh or something, but we don't do it, right? People in richer, more developed economies, we work in the service sector. We sit in offices. We write reports. We send emails. That's our job. So consumerism can't really be the explanation for our longer working weeks. So there must be something else going on. And David Graeber has this very academic term of bullshit jobs. And now it's very important that I give a proper definition of what a bullshit job is. Because you might say, well, that guy is a historian. The definition of a bullshit job. No, it doesn't work that way. A bullshit job is a job of which a person, him or herself, says, you know what? Doesn't really matter if I don't show up at work. I don't really do anything. I don't really create anything. I just don't add anything of value to the common good. That is a bullshit job. So people define it for themselves. And at first I thought, how big can this really be? Because it was mainly anecdotal evidence that Graeber had in his essay. So I wrote a piece about it, and then just the confessions just started pouring in. Lots of people emailing me and saying, yes. I've got exactly one of those jobs. He's talking about me. So at that point I thought, this is interesting. I want to know more about this. And I started looking at some polls. Now the first poll I found was from Belgium, where it turns out 30% of Belgian workers said, my job is pretty much meaningless. I don't add anything of value. And at that point I thought, Belgium, huh? We have this eternal rivalry between Holland and Belgium. I thought, this is only logical. But then I should say that another poll came in, which was actually done in Holland, where the number was 40%. So it was problematic for me. And just a year ago, I think now, we've seen the first academic paper. They don't use the term bullshit jobs anymore. You have to Google for socially meaningless jobs, which is, I guess, the politically correct term for this kind of phenomenon. And 2 Dutch economists looked at a data set of almost 100,000 workers that were asked this question. Do you think your job is anything of meaning to society? Turns out 25% across, this is the average across 40 developed countries, is not really sure. Probably not. 25% is the number, which is, I think, quite astounding. Now, if you delve a little bit deeper into the numbers, one very interesting thing is that actually there are 4 times as many socially meaningless jobs in the private sector as in the public sector. So this runs completely counter to the narrative that we always hear about, wasteful government, etc. No. If you ask people themselves, they're 4 times as likely to think their job is meaningless in the private sector as in the public sector. Now, who are these people who consider their job meaningless? Well, I can tell you one thing. They're not teachers. They're not garbage collectors. They're not nurses. We're mostly talking about, actually people who went to wonderful universities with beautiful LinkedIn profiles, who work in finance or in marketing or in management or something like that, and who are, according to our standard criteria, are very successful, but still at the end of the day, you give them 1 beer, maybe 2, and they'll admit that, it just doesn't really matter what they do. And it got me thinking that this is quite a crazy world we live in, right? We have these very expensive institutions of education, law schools and business schools, where we spend billions of dollars or euros on, and we educate our best and brightest, and then they go on and do a job that they personally think is, pretty much nonsense. They do that for 20 or 30 years, earn a huge amount of money, don't pay their taxes over that often, and then they have this midlife crisis. They're utterly depressed. Then we have all these psychiatrists that I was talking about earlier come in, and then they, make a change in their lives and they start painting for the rest of their lives. Now, if you want to know what the kind of society looks like that I'm advocating, is to just cut the crap, immediately start painting. That's sort of the basic income society that I'm advocating. Another way to look at this is to look at strikes. So what happens when certain professions go on strike? This is a strike of garbage collectors that happened in 1968. Lasted for 6 days, disaster. The emergency state had to be declared. Turns out you really can't do without garbage collectors, doing quite important work. And at that point I wondered, has it ever happened throughout history that the bankers went on strike? Quite an interesting question, obviously. So I started looking, basically started in the archives around the invention of money. When was it? Like 5,000 years ago. But no, bankers don't really go on strike. Started looking, researching more. And then it happened. I stumbled upon one example in the whole history of finance. Maybe there are others, but I haven't found them. And this was in Ireland, actually. Where else? In Ireland, 1970. So what happened is that the bankers were angry that their wages were not keeping up with inflation, and they said, you know what, you'll have it. We'll go on strike, and then you'll see just how important we are, right? And all the experts at that point, like all the economists, they all predicted disaster. This was supposed to be like a heart attack for the economy. How are we ever going to survive without the financial sector doing all this important and productive work, they argued. And so they said, you really can't do that. And they pleaded with the bankers, no, don't do it. And they said, no, we're going to do it. We're going to go ahead. And then you'll see how important we are. So the strike started. And it lasted for 6 months in the end. Garbage collector strike 6 days, banker strike 6 months. And, nothing much happened, actually. After 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work. It's interesting to know what happened behind the scenes, because obviously you can't do without a financial sector, right? Money is a very important invention. So what the Irish did is they invented their own money system. They started writing IOUs on the backs of cigar boxes and on toilet paper. And this worked pretty well, probably because the pub owners, back then Ireland had like 15,000 pubs, they became the new bankers, right? There's one historian who later wrote that if you sell liquids to your clients, you probably know something about their liquidity as well. So they were the perfect new bankers, and the system worked fine. And I think the whole morale of the tale is that obviously we need money, obviously we need a financial sector, but maybe we can do it without a lot of the bullshit in it that we now see. Not very long ago, in the 50s and the 60s, we had a financial sector that was just like the size of 1%, maybe 2% of GDP. And to be a banker was a bit like being a school principal, a respected but a little bit boring job. It was all right. And this only changed very recently. People have forgotten about that. What I try to do in my book is to imagine a society where things could be radically different, where people have the freedom to make their own choices, right? When it comes to something like basic income, which is a monthly grant, to pay for your basic needs, but that really gives you the freedom to make your own choices, move to a different city, move to a different job, start a new company. I think that if we would implement that, a couple of things would happen. In the first place, let's say you're young and you're thinking about what you want to study. Well, nowadays, so many young aspiring students have this conversation with their parents or their family where they say, you know what? I want to study the arts or history. That sounds really cool. And then they have, that's interesting, yeah. But you got to make money as well, right? And then they go to business school and have their depression 20 years later. People could just, with a basic income, they could say to their parents, you know what, I can always fall back on my basic income and I can actually do what I want to do. The other thing that is even more important that would happen with a basic income is that it would also be a redistribution of power. A lot of people have asked me this question. With a basic income, who still wants to be a cleaner? Who still wants to be a garbage collector? That's a big problem with your theory. You can throw it in the garbage already because it's going to destroy your society. And my response then is no, it's going to destroy your life because now you finally have to do your own dishes, right? If you can't afford your cleaner anymore, because the cleaner has much more bargaining power and the wages will go up, right? Of the garbage collectors and the teachers and the nurses. So in the long run, I think that a basic income helps to let us move towards a society where the wages will much better reflect the social value of the work that we actually do. The ideal here, the utopian ideal, is a society where, say, garbage collectors actually earn more than bankers. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Thank you very much. Shall I sit down?
Thank you very much, Rutger. Thanks for that inspiring talk, and we'll come to the basic income in a lot more detail in the discussion, I hope. Mm-hmm. For which I would like to ask Mrs. Rehm, Mr. Rezai, and Mr. Snyder to come up on stage as well, please. I will introduce the panelists to you one by one with their probably preliminary remarks to what we've just heard. to my very right, to your very left, is Armon Rezai. He's professor at the Institute of Ecological Economics at the Wirtschaftsuniversität Wien. Climate change economics and environmental policy. We have just heard, and there's many more examples in the book of the long tradition of thinkers and also politicians who predicted this continuously decreasing working hours. And they all had good reasons to do so. And then that came to a halt, as you said, in the 70s. And your main reasons for that are consumerism and bullshit jobs. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that, Armon Rezai?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here from my side as well. I wouldn't quite agree with it because my point would be that when I read your book, the subtitle in English is "And How to Get There," right? And I felt like the second part was not really addressed in the book. So I think we heard a lot about also in the talk today about what is a utopia that we would all, most of us in this room probably would agree to. And we're all realists, so that's a utopia for us. The question, though, is if we look at the reductions in working time in Europe, and you have a graph in your book, we see that it kind of tapers off in the 70s and 80s. And in the book, I didn't read much for it, but maybe I didn't see it. My reason for that would be that it really is about how to get there. And it's about social progress, and social progress was always something we had to struggle for. You had to fight for your social rights, and not only do you have to fight for them, but I think in Eastern Europe, in the US, we see now today that if we don't exercise our freedom and our rights, we actually lose them again. So it is about struggles, and I feel like that this is really the reason why we haven't been able to make further progress towards the 15-hour work week, that this whole problem of how do we actually implement something that we think is socially useful? And if there's somebody who thinks that, as you said, I don't want to do my dishes, I want to be able to pay for my cleaner so I don't have to do my dishes and do the laundry as well while they're at it. So how do you address this question of implementing things if there are people who are actually very good at defending the status quo?
Mm-hmm. So basically also your argument would be on the bullshit jobs, that even if I thought that my job was socially completely meaningless, and if I felt it, I wouldn't change the system by saying, okay, I stop it tomorrow, because it's not that easy.
I think the important distinction is between the socially meaningful, right? I think a lot of companies have a lot of so-called bullshit jobs because they're economically meaningful for them. So marketing works great. If I put out an ad, people buy my stuff. So of course I want you to put out one of these meaningful, for me as a company, ads, but for you as a person, meaningless or socially not relevant jobs. So I think that's again coming into who calls the shots and for whom am I doing this? So am I doing the job in order to pay the rent? And I'm doing something which is not useful, but it pays the rent, as you said, and then I can go to my psychiatrist and I can go painting on afterwards. But in a way, so I see why you say that there's a basic income that will be good to have. I just think that the bullshit jobs, and especially the work week, is something how you have to implement policies. And how do you get to implement these policies if they're so against vested interests?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a really good point, if I can make a very short remark. If I would rewrite the first chapter of my book, I would try and make it less Steven Pinkerish, right? Steven Pinker, American intellectual, wrote this book about, again, the incredible progress we made in the past 200 years. But then if you look at all these graphs, it seems as if it happens automatically, right? It goes down, Absolutely. Extreme poverty goes down, health goes up. It's just like a law of history. And what you forget is just the struggle behind it all, right? And there's a tendency among a certain type of intellectual to, proclaim, progress is great, and then be very dismissive of social justice warriors today, even though all that progress was made possible by the social justice warriors of the past, right? Yeah. Who were back then seen as very annoying. Yeah.
It's a very good point. Let me come to Mrs. Rehm, because I think that will fit in there very well as well. Miriam Rehm, let me shortly introduce her. She's an economist and as of this year, junior professor for socioeconomics at the University Duisburg-Essen. Before going to Germany, she has worked for the Arbeiterkammer, the Austrian Federal Chamber of Labor, And one of her research focuses lies on empirical inequality research. So there exists quite some literature on lowering the working hours. Mrs. Rehm, from all the empirical data that you know and that you have collected yourself, are we ready for this 15 hours work week? And to maybe reframe that question, who is that we? Whom of us is ready for that 15 hours work week?
Yeah, so first let me tie in with something that you said, that we are getting better in every aspect. And I think there's one aspect that is actually not true, and that is inequality within countries, right? Internationally, you're right? The global inequality is going down. But national, within country, inequality has actually been rising. And that's one of the important points of Thomas Piketty, who you also cite in his co-authors, that this is really one area where we're not seeing the progress. And this is, of course, then we immediately in my research area, which is distribution and inequality. And to me, it seems what matters a lot, it's maybe not so much consumerism, but it's really an issue of the relative position. If you consider two scenarios, usually if you ask people, one option for you to live in would be for you to earn 2,000 euros a month, and everybody else has 1,000, right? The other option that you could have is that you have 3,000, but everybody else has 5,000 or 4,500, let's say. Most people, not everybody, but most people choose the first option, where you yourself have less money, however, you have more than everybody else. So the relative income position matters. Now, if we turn to work week and work time that you asked about, if you do the same scenario, you ask people, you have 2 weeks of free time, 2 weeks vacation per year, and everybody else has 1 week, one option that you can choose, or the other would be for you to have 3 and everybody else has 5. Most people, in this case now, choose the second scenario. They are more concerned about the absolute level of vacation time that they have. So for me, this speaks very much to what you're saying, that it really depends where we are. And with work time, with income, we're at a point where the relative distribution matters, not so much the absolute level anymore. With work time, we're still at a level where the absolute level matters, where we have not gotten to the point where it makes sense for everybody to look where everybody else is, rather than thinking about how much free time do we have at our hands ourselves in absolute terms. So this really is exactly what you're saying. You know, we have made so little progress in work time reductions in the past decades and centuries, especially, and it has ground to a halt in the past decades, that the absolute level still matters. And now let me give 2 examples from Austria, if I may still. You tell me when I'm supposed to stop. So let me start with the positive example first, right? The social partners have negotiated the option for many workers in certain industries to take their yearly increases, right? You know that in Austria you have these negotiations between social partners, and every year your income goes up according to the negotiations, right? Now, a few years back, in 2015, they started introducing in the collective bargaining agreements the option to not take this in money, but in time, right? So instead of increasing your yearly wage or your monthly wage, if you divide it by 14, instead you can have that increase in work time, up to 4 times in your life and over time. And what we've seen in the research, and I must say I've not collected it myself, unfortunately I would have loved to, but this is really other people's work that I'm citing here. What we've seen is that workers really want that. Employees are really interested in getting that raise. And regarding to your question, who is it? We see that it's not just men, it's not just the rich. It's not just the elderly that are on a higher income scale. It's really across the distribution. With employees, with salaried employees, it's an even gender distribution. It is young workers as much as old workers that would like to have this. It is across the entire income distribution that people are trying to take up that offer of more work, of more free time, not more work. Right. So we're seeing this matters to people. Now, is everybody getting that? And the answer is no. And why not? because employers are not offering it. The number one reason why this has not happened, because it's not just at the bargaining at the sectoral level, but really at the firm level, wherever this then has to be put into as an agreement, the most cited reason is for employers saying no to this option and not granting it, even though workers and works councils are trying to implement that. Mm-hmm. May I still get to the second, or should I stop now?
One more.
Very briefly. Very briefly. The second example. And unfortunately, that is a more negative one, because really what we've seen politically in Austria in the recently was actually the opposite of what you're arguing for, and with very good reason. I totally agree with your goals of having a good life for everything, because that's what free time means nowadays for many of us, is having more time for our families, for ourselves, for anything that we choose to do, for painting. So what we've seen, however, politically, is that actually the maximum work time has been increasing, right? We've had the introduction of a 60-hour work week and a 12-hour work day, and we're now as maximums, and we're now only constrained by the absolute minimum levels that the EU sets, right? For countries that really do not manage their own labor relations, right? So that is what we are sort of falling back to. And the research, of course, has been virtually unanimous in saying this means that productivity goes down. At this level, if you work 60 hours as opposed to 59, actually total output goes down. Employers lose. Nonetheless, politically, this was something demanded by a small group of employers, of very large firms, and it was fought tooth and nail by trade unions, right, and workers. I mean, there was massive demonstration in Austria. So it was still pushed through against the economic evidence, against the facts, and against the wishes of the majority. I think the surveys were fairly clear on that this was not a wish of the majority of people. And we've seen very similar things happen with the wealth tax debate in Austria. So, it was, even though we have the facts on our side, we know now how the distribution of wealth is, how skewed it is, and how small a group would be affected by a wealth tax and the income that it would raise, rather. So my question to you would be, is it really a lack of vision that we have? Is the problem galvanizing the people for a utopia? Mm-hmm. Or is it a question of political power and what we can do politically? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Before letting you answer, Rutger, I would like to introduce our fourth panelist, probably handing over the question to you also. Timothy Snyder is Professor of History at Yale University and the Permanent Fellow of the Institute of Human Sciences here in Vienna. He's a renowned expert in European history, especially 20th century history, on which he has written many highly priced books. Highly priced, meaning for which he got many prizes. Very expensive. Sorry for my English there.
You probably can't afford it.
All of your basic income will
once
go to that
proposals go through, no one's going to be able to buy my book.
All right, I'm sorry about that. He won many prizes for his many books on European history. What is also interesting, against the background of his historical understanding, he has also become a very sharp and pointed analyst of present-day politics. And here I would just like to mention your two recent books. They are On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, published in 2017 as a direct response to Donald Trump becoming president of the US. And finally, your latest book came out last year. The title is The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. Both books deal with the need to understand, develop, and defend democracy, if I may make it thus short. What would you say on that question? Is everything that Rutger and the other two have mentioned so far, that the fact that we are not there, is that really a lack of vision or a lack of utopia, or is it more a result of, the current distribution of power?
Okay, so let me start by thanking you for the invitation to take part in this discussion. I'm very glad to be here. I want to start with a point which is very important that I think that's worth stressing. and that is that the status quo is not realistic. So, the counter argument against many of the things that Rutger and others propose is that, well, they're not realistic for reasons X, Y, and Z. That might be true, but the status quo is totally unrealistic, right? Mm-hmm. In the status quo, our species is gone in a few generations. So if we just sort of hang out and roll with the current way we have digitalization and the current climate problem, we don't have great-grandchildren. So, depending on your definition of realistic, the status quo is probably not realistic. So the conversation can't only be about what seems realistic now. The conversation has to have an ethical dimension. In other words, if you don't have an ethical dimension, then you can't actually imagine a different future. And if you can't imagine a different future, then you're not being realistic because the status quo is just not realistic, which is why discussions like this, which start from different premises, I think are so important. Now, I want to take a slightly different tack on this question of why things feel doable or not doable. I think part of the problem has to do with our sense of time. That politics is about space and time, and the democracies, to make a long story very short, have generally existed and thrived by taking a lot of other people's space. And now in the 21st century, that's not really possible. Our politics is suddenly all about time. And the people who we call the populists are the ones who talk about the past, and they see their enemies incorrectly as the people who talk about the future, who we call the Greens or the liberals. And the people who are in the middle talking about the present are having a problem all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. So this business of time is incredibly important, right? On these curves that Rutger showed us, the curve that I'd like to see would be how many people are actually thinking about the future at all. Because the striking thing about our whole hydrocarbon revolution and that whole 200 years when Europeans got to rule the world, it was wonderful, great, except for everybody else. The thing about those 300 years is that Europeans always had a vision of the future, competing visions of the future. And the interesting thing about the 21st century, and I think why this book did strike a nerve, is that no one knows how to talk about the future anymore. So the populist move is to say, let's forget about the future entirely, and let's imagine a moment when everybody was a white male, but somehow nobody was gay, right? Let's imagine that moment, right? That will be our past, and let's dream of that. Why that's funny just occurred to me. Hopefully it will occur to you in 5 more seconds, but the comedy of that particular fantasy just dawned on me. Maybe I'm slow. And meanwhile, everyone else has a hard time thinking about the future. And I think there are structural reasons for this. One of them is climate change. Climate change is so frightening that people deny it or are afraid of it. Another one of these is inequality. Ökonomen Armon and a number of people have been talking about this for a very long time. If inequality becomes extreme, then it's very hard for the people, even if they're doing relatively well compared to people who were poor 100 years ago, right? If inequality becomes extreme, you can't move around in your own society, and therefore you can't think about the future, that's already happened in the Anglo-Saxon countries. That's part of the Trump phenomenon. When Trump says the American dream is dead, he's unfortunately actually right, statistically speaking. This goes to your point. And with the micro implication of that, the implication of that at the level of individuals and families, is that people don't think about the future anymore. And when people don't think about the future, then it's harder to find the space to make arguments like this. And the third thing which has happened to time is digitalization. The time that you spend in front of screens is time that you're not thinking about the future. In fact, it's time that your brain is being trained to think in certain kinds of loops where you lose track of time entirely. And that is, I think, the third thing which is taking the future away from us. So I think there are structural reasons why when we hear these ideas, they seem tricky for us, and that has to do with the total inability to talk about the future. And so the future, all of these policies are about thinking about the future, but they're also about making the future real again. And then on the last point of digitalization, I think there's something else which is going on, which is that in the Keynes prediction or in the Asimov prediction, the robots are working for us. Right? I have heartburn, and so I have to leave, and a robot comes in, and he continues my discussion at exactly the place where I am. Right?
Maybe better.
Makes the same jokes, right? But it's even funnier because he's got a metal face with a fixed smile, and so he's a big winner, right? But in the real world, that's not happening. In the real world, we're working for the robots, and I think that's the thing which hasn't quite been anticipated and isn't fully understood. that the way digitalization is working out for a lot of people is that it's creating the bullshit jobs, or it's making real jobs more bullshit jobs. And what artificial intelligence is actually really good at least at this stage, is not doing your job for you. It's at finding the people who are willing to do the bullshit job 1,000 miles away from you. In fact, a lot of things which are peddled as AI are actually humans very far away from you being paid almost no money to do things which are then sold to you as the amazing feats of artificial intelligence. So, I mean, as a broad point, I would say that's another thing. I have a lot more to say about all this, but as a broad point, one of the things which I think is blocking us is that the robots aren't really working for us in the way that we imagine. Oftentimes, we're working for the robots without realizing it. Another example of this, just one brief example of this, is the way the labor market works in the United States of America. The labor market in the United States of America is largely frozen. Why is that? Is it because we don't have smart, interesting people who can do new things? No. It's because if you send an application for an American job, or for that matter to an American university, it's already screened by algorithms before a human being ever sees it. And so if you don't have the right combinations of words on your application, your application will literally never be considered by another human being, even though you might be really good at the job, right? And that's just one example of how the humans are working for, the robots or the bots or the algorithms in this case, rather than the other way around. And that freezes us and makes us feel uncomfortable.
Thank you very much for setting up like the whole background and the whole stage. And obviously that all that is to be kept in mind when we are talking about the realism of the utopias, or the thinking of the future that we are talking about here. I would nevertheless try to make one look in the past now, since the subtitle of this Vorlesung is the time, are we ready for the universal basic income? And maybe just to give us this one historic background, because I already announced it in announcing you too, there are so many examples in history where that has been tried. Could you give us one or two just to see what we are talking about there and how it worked out when it has actually been tried? It's not all such a new idea.
And this is actually like one of the main lessons of history for me, is that things can be different. There's just nothing inevitable about the way we've structured our society right now, and it could be a lot worse. And you can read Professor Snyder's books about that. But it can also be a lot better, right? And, to give one example, when I was touring America, the United States, with my book, people were astonished to hear that actually Richard Nixon, of all people, almost implemented a guaranteed basic income at the beginning of the 70s. And at the end of the 60s, almost everyone was in favor of this, from the left to the right. All the great Nobel Prize winning economists were saying, yes, we got to do this. It's obvious, we've got the evidence, we've got the means, the science is in. Let's do it already. You had huge experiments back then in both Canada and the US, where thousands of families received the basic income just to test what would happen, right? Would they all stop working? What would the effects on health be, on kids? And time again, they found that, kids do better in school, crime goes down, people don't stop working massively. There's a very limited reduction in working hours, which is, quite a good thing often. But people just completely forgotten about this episode of American history, which is also full of ironies. It was actually, apart from the fact that it was Richard Nixon, which is quite ironical, there were some experiments back then. One of them was in Seattle, where, again, they found all these positive results, but they also discovered that the divorce rate went up by 50%. So at that point, all the conservatives said, or many of them said, we don't want basic income. This is going to make women much too independent. So let's stop this at once. It was only 10 years later that they found out that actually statistical mistake had been made.
So that was not true at all. I find that quite interesting.
True.
No, it was a reason,
at least not in this case.
Yeah, for ending the project, and then
maybe in other experiments. Yeah. But it also shows you sort of the contingency of history. It's easily when you really look at this episode, it's so easy to imagine an alternative outcome. Just a couple of things happening in a different way. There was, for example, an advisor of Richard Nixon at the time, who had just read about something that happened in England at the beginning of the 19th century. Had read about the Speen-Hemland system, which was a sort of like the first basic income that the world ever saw, or at least had some of its features. And this advisor had read about this and had discovered, or at least he thought so, that this was a total disaster, right? The Spiegelman system caused, again, breakdown of marriages. People turn out to be massively lazy, blah, blah, blah. And he told Nixon about this. And Nixon was hugely impressed by this. And he changed his rhetorics around basic income. And some historians have argued that this made all the difference, is that was one of the reasons why in the end it wasn't, it didn't go through the Senate. Now, if you actually look at what did really happen in the 19th century in England, you had this system, Spiegelman system, which most historians now agree was, not perfect, but, did help a little bit. And then in 1834, there was a report written, like the first time that a government, in this case, the British government, really did or at least pretended to do a lot of research on a policy like this. And 700 pages, again, the evidence supposedly showed that it was a total disaster. It was only 150 years later that historians found out that this whole report was like fake news. The conclusion was already decided upon in advance. Anyway, long story short, isn't it amazing that like something that happens in Britain in the beginning of the 19th century then changes Nixon's mind 150 years later, and that might be one of the reasons why we don't have a guaranteed basic income in the US nowadays, and maybe even in other countries, because we all know that it would have been quite influential if the US would have adopted a policy like this. It really shows you the contingency of history.
Mrs. Rehm, how would you argue on that? Is it just more or less by accident that we don't have a basic universal income by now?
I'm not so sure. I think there's a reason why European welfare states went a different direction, honestly. I totally see the point, we really want to sort of step out of the capitalist rat race, right? You don't want to be trapped in bullshit jobs that are invented just to keep people busy, right? And that, you have a huge issue with financialization, and there's a lot of research on that. I myself am doing it as well, also with the link between financialization and digitization, that a lot of it is actually done by highly financialized companies. A lot of the digitization is driven by that. And of course, the universal basic income, what it does, it values non-market work, right? That's the main thing. And that's what, feminist economists like me have been demanding and harping on about for decades. Right? So I totally see the point and the logic behind it. I'm just uncomfortable with that specific idea. Right. And I also agree totally with your point that means testing has gone too far. Right. What we're doing, means testing, is really completely inefficient. There is no question about that in my mind, at least. And I think that the research is really also pointing that way. That we have a lot of public finance experts that are really good at that, and also at our institute in Duisburg, Essen. So that I totally agree with. The big question always is the key pivotal question, the Gretchenfrage, is how much and how is it financed, right? So in Austria, if you take all monetary transfers, right? I presume we're not in the US here, right? We all want to keep the education system. We want to keep the healthcare system. We're not going to take we want to keep public transport and public housing. We don't want to really transfer all that into a basic income, right? But if you take all monetary transfers that are happening right now to people from the Austrian government, you're roughly in the order of a good 70 billion. You divide that by the total population, you get to roughly 12 times a year, 680 euros, which is nice, I'd like to have that. But it's, I take it. Single mother, financially struggling, I totally take it. Nonetheless, I don't see myself jumping out of work for that. I don't see myself, stopping work. And I think a lot of people would have problems, getting out of it on that money. And so essentially what you would have to do, because you're cutting all monetary transfers, is you're cutting pensions above the bare minimum. Minimum pensioners would be getting roughly the same still, but everything above that would be gone. All unemployment insurance would be gone, and all of family transfers would be gone. So what children are getting, of course, instead they would be getting the minimum income. And at the same time, you're paying transfer in order to do that, to cut all pensions above the minimum, or largely cut them. You're giving income to people such as us here on the podium, and I don't want to step on any toes, but I would assume that we're all well above the average. We don't really need that money, right? So I do see the point, and you know why? But what is happening? You know, our transfer system in developed welfare states is highly progressive, right? Low-income groups get much more out of it than high-income groups. High-income groups, they do because they should still keep buying into the welfare state, and that's important. They do get some money out of it, but low-income groups get much more. The tax system is roughly proportional, so you don't have any redistribution there. So the big redistribution is happening through the transfer system. And what a minimum income does is it makes that transfer system less progressive because you're suddenly giving that money to people higher up the income distribution. So why not just dial back means testing, right? Go more towards a social welfare state as it already is. Why not expand massively? And I totally agree that we need a utopia and that we need to have an option to get out of the rat race, right? So I do see the point. Why not dramatically expand the educational leave, Bildungsgrenze, right? Where you can get out of it for a year, 2 years, you know, stop means testing, stop saying, you know, you need to achieve something in that time. But then give people an amount of money that they can live on for that time. Why not, you know, massively invest in public infrastructure, in public transport, you know, things that we need to go get to that social and ecological transition that you know, otherwise we'd be gone. I just think that the measure is really something that is taking us back really a step. It's not taking us forward where we need to go.
So the way you calculated how much that would be for every person, basically that would result into the basic income for everybody in Austria would mean an increase in inequality and not enough to live on for those who live on the basic income. What would your comment be on that? Because that's obviously, that's the two basic questions. How do we afford it and how much would it be?
Well, it's really important to acknowledge that there are quite a few versions of basic income out there that increase poverty, that increase inequality, etc., that are maybe not a very good idea. And especially in the US, there are quite a few libertarians who advocate this kind of policy, right? They say, abolish the whole welfare state, you know, get rid of Medicare, get rid of Medicaid, just give people a little bit of money and that's going to be much more efficient. That's not what I'm advocating. You know, I really see basic income as, it should be the crowning achievement of social democracy. Right? We have universal healthcare, quality public education, quality public transport, and then to top it all off, a guaranteed basic income. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and also, a little bit technical. So, if I say, let's implement a guaranteed basic income, which is just, you know, you abolish poverty. As soon as you fall below the poverty line, your income is automatically topped up. Right? This is what they did in the Canadian experiment, the story that I tell in my book. All the American experiments were also like this. Economists call it a negative income tax. So if you're at a certain point in the income distribution, you know, you earn less and less money, at some point the government is just starting to, you don't pay taxes anymore, but you know, the government is basically starting to give you taxes. You're taxing the government in that way. And you know, many economists see this as a sensible, sane proposal. This happened to me quite a few times in discussions. They say, oh, you're in favor of a negative income tax, like a guaranteed basic income. Oh, but then it's all right. It's just a universal basic income that we would give everyone a basic income that they're against. But the thing is, the net effect of those policies are essentially similar. Because in a universal basic income situation, indeed, many people like us sitting here on stage would indeed receive a basic income, but pay a lot more in additional taxes. And that's the thing. I'm absolutely not saying that if you would implement a proposal like this, that you wouldn't increase taxes as well. I don't want to do this in a fiscally neutral way or anything. You know, I'm a big fan of taxes. So, and I think that especially, you know, when it comes to wealth taxes or, and a really interesting model here is what they do in Alaska. You know, they have this permanent oil dividend. Everyone gets money from the income from oil. I think that's really a model that you could expand, you know, that you have sort of a fund where a lot of capital income is coming in and that you distribute this as sort of a freedom dividend to everyone in the population. But I do agree with you as well that probably, if I would be an advisor for a politician right now and they would say, what do you want me to advocate? I would say, well, probably right now it's much easier to defend a guaranteed basic income, and that's probably, have much less means testing, not so much a paternalistic welfare state, move in that direction. And then in the long run, you can make it universal.
Coming to the question of taxes in a minute, I would like to ask the other economist on the panel what your position is on the idea of a universal basic income. Is that realistic, radical, both?
I know why he calls it a utopia, having higher tax. And he's a good politician as well. He talks about the universal basic income on the one hand, but he doesn't talk about how he's going to fund it. And that's going to be the whole taxes. And that makes it even more utopia because we already there are enough studies which say that, or enough people in this room probably who would say that a wealth tax or a capital income tax would be a good thing. The way that we do it in Austria is really not enough. But we are not even, that gets me back to my first point that I tried to make. How do we get there? There's already something which is such a small piece of this whole grand scheme of a guaranteed universal basic income. And we're not even getting that. We're not even able to tax people on the capital income in the way that we tax labor income. Mm-hmm. We tax it at 25% flat out. And if you pay more, if you work and you pay a higher tax rate on your wage income, that's fine. And by the way, we keep that right away as a state. You don't have to declare it. We know how much you make. But with the capital, we don't talk about it, who owns it. We don't talk about where it goes. The bank gives us the tax receipts, and that's all the questions we're going to ask. Mm-hmm. And so it really is a question, how are we able to get there?
Mm-hmm. Isn't it also a question that this question of how do we get there, whenever I hear these discussions, they usually come to a point very quickly where one says, well, do we do that locally, regionally? Can we afford to do that in just one city or just one country? Do we have to, at the same time, also talk about that being a universal basic income for all of Europe? What would be your point there? Is that something? Is the way to get there? And we will come back to the financing in the taxes in a minute. But is the way to get there one where we should look at a very local level and try it there, or should we have the global view?
I would like to defer this answer to Rutger because I think he's much better in answering this question. I would like to come back and hear him a bit, taking up my own answer. I'd like to come back to what Timothy said before about status quo is not an option, is basically, I think, what you said, because it's just not feasible in terms of environmental degradation that we're looking at. And there is exactly something that I would like to disagree with. I wish I could agree that the current status quo is not an option. Because if it was an option, I would be faithful enough to say if we have to change it, we will change. But there's nothing preventing us from ruining the climate. There's nothing in us preventing to going to 6 degrees. And it will probably be a world which will be a lot more uneven. It will be a world which is a lot less stable. And it will probably be a world like Mad Max, where there are a couple of very rich people and who have access to resources and the other ones scrambling to survive. And there's nothing that keeps us from going into that world. It's exactly this question of how do we change the world into a way that we think is more equitable.
But that's my point. I mean,
then
nobody would watch Mad Max and say, oh, that guy strapped to the front of the bus going through the Australian desert, with his blood in a tube feeding somebody. Maybe that was the sequel, actually.
Great movie.
But nobody, the sequel was much better than the original, but nobody's going to watch that movie and say, oh, yes, this is a portrait of realism, right? That's all I'm saying. I agree with you that we don't have to do the things that we should do. What I'm trying to get around is the tendency of people to think that what is realistic. And what is in fact, in many ways, a dystopia and is becoming even more dystopian, as your own remarks suggested, right? And so that's why I'm just trying to get around that idea that what is somehow has that the burden of proof is on those who want to make changes. I don't think so. right? I think the burden of proof would be on people who say, yeah, let's roll with this action. And if I could say just one thing about the local and global and the financing, there are some creative ways to think about this too, like global cap and dividend on carbon emissions as the way to fund. I mean, as the political way to make taxing on carbon realistic, at least in places like America, is to connect it to a dividend for the whole population. But that's also a way of doing universal income. And if I were a European Union citizen and I were thinking like, what am I going to do with those big, bad, terrible American tech companies? Which is a really good question. One thing you can do with them is you can tax them on the logic that they are all profiting from the little bits of your soul that they take from you every day without asking.
Every day.
And that since that can't be calculated perfectly, just how much of your soul they're taking every day, that therefore that's an argument for taxing them and giving all of you a few thousand euros a year, right?
And as I said, this is actually the model that you already see in Alaska, which is, quite conservative state. Since the 1970s, it was a conservative governor called Jay Hammond. Not a very lefty guy in any way, but he implemented this policy of having a Alaska permanent dividend fund, and everyone's receiving around $2,000 on an annual basis, which is not enough to live on, but it makes a real difference for families. If you're a family of 4, you get $8,000. It's one of the reasons why Alaska is, I think, the state with the lowest inequality level of all the 50 states. In a conservative state, and it's incredibly popular. As soon as you just suggest that you want to do something about it, your career is finished as a politician in Alaska. So I think that's really the model to think about it.
I'm really sorry to be the party pooper here all the time.
Go ahead, yeah.
The thing is, first of all, I'm not surprised at all that most economists you talk to are happy about the negative income tax, right? And this is a very conservative, mainstream economics idea that they're very happy with because it's the support. Because essentially what it does is it subsidizes low-wage jobs in the US. This is the effect. There's a really good study by Heidi Schierholz and her colleagues at EPI recently out on that. That is what the earned income tax credit in the US does.
Sorry, but negative income tax is also if you don't work.
Right.
So it's also it should be completely unconditional.
Sure.
And maybe this is
but that's a small addition on top of that. But
I think it makes all the difference because then you can really fall back on it. You can just stop working and you still get your basic income.
And I agree with the idea, but it's not at a level where you can live from it, right?
Yeah.
And a few thousand per year we've discussed. But the thing is, if you raise taxes, it is actually going to be fiscally neutral, right? I mean, the interesting question is, first, which taxes are you going to raise that are going to raise 70 billion, and that is not going to be enough? You want, in Austria, 140 billion you want if you have a reasonable basic income for everyone. And then Alaska, I think, is a really interesting example because right now what they're doing is cutting the education budget by half. They're closing the humanities, they're closing the arts and science because they don't have the funds, because they're throwing, they're giving it in the to everybody. Gießkannenprinzip, and I'm blanking on the verb. They're giving it to everybody the same amount. So they are in a dire, and I'm not surprised that that's what conservative politicians would be doing. They're in dire straits, fiscally and budgetary wise, because of what they've been doing instead of investing in a public welfare state, in investing, which they've also been doing. But it is a problem, I think, if you give the people to people individually. So I think if you want to think big, and I think you should, again, I'm an unwilling party pooper here. I really don't want to ruin the notion of that we have to think big. So I think really what's happening in the US right now of thinking big is MMT, right? Where you are MMT, it's the modern monetary theory, where you are sort of stopping to think that you have to fund everything, where the idea is really you have to finance it through the central bank. Now it gets really complicated. We're going to get to the next person pooping on that. So I don't think that is the solution to everything, but I think we should stop being so concerned about government deficits as we are at this stage, and as we are bound to be by European Union rules at this stage, and think a bit more creatively about alternatives. Because taxes at this stage, to get to that level of 140 billion just for Austria, that is some big money that you're talking about, and I agree. Let's impose massive carbon taxes. Let's impose taxes on digital companies based on where they're actually making the profits and not on where they are sheltering them in tax havens, right? And not where they're pushing them across the globe. But the numbers just don't add up at this stage for me.
I would like to comment you on that first and then go to Armon Rezai.
Well, the main thing I would say is that I actually do see a lot of progress when it comes to, talking about taxes or tax avoidance. It's the funny thing about all these things is that the moment people start to have discussions about this and start getting angry, that is exactly the moment when things are improving, because we're actually talking about it. Like 5-10 years ago, tax avoidance wasn't an issue. People were not talking about it. Was it not happening? It was happening on a massive scale. But there was, compared to now, relatively little debate about it. It's also when it comes to basic income. Just 5 years ago, it was a completely forgotten idea. Almost no one was talking about it. The first talks I was giving about basic income were for small groups of, long-haired anarchists who were a little bit smelly. And, that was my audience back then. So I think there's a lot of, I'm not saying that you have to be optimistic, but I'm actually quite hopeful. Climate change is another thing. Just the urgency of that we're talking about a climate emergency right now. Again, so much has changed in just 5 years. So I think there's, in that respect, a lot of reason for hope that we don't have to be too depressed about, how are we ever going to get there? There's a lot that is changing actually right now. Now, when it comes to the financing of a basic income, what I also would like to emphasize is that there's a lot of reason to think that eradicating poverty is actually an investment that pays for itself. Because healthcare costs go down, kids do much better in school, and this is something that all of the models where they try to calculate what basic income costs is never included. Now, I've got some examples in the book, for all our other policies, like, for example, homelessness. Every dollar or euro you invest in someone that is homeless, you get it back like 2 or 3 times in lower judicial costs, police costs, etc. Nowadays, we're spending sometimes on people who are chronically homeless, in Europe, like 50,000 euros on an annual basis, or 100,000. I've seen numbers that go up as high as 200,000. And it's not that these people get this money, it's just the incredibly inefficient paternalistic system that we've created around it. Now, what if we just would give the people the money and just say, okay, homelessness, what is it? It's a lack of a home. Give people a home. Poverty, what is it? It's a lack of money. Give people money. This is not rocket science. It's relatively simple to solve.
There's these, that's probably one example that one should emphasize on too, that you're giving on so many different cases in your book that I'm just thinking of the Housing First initiative that we have in Vienna now, that the idea is to give homeless people a home before giving them, education, job training or anything else, because that already would make it a lot better for them, and they would probably find a lot of what they really need for themselves then. And you advocate for the same, give poor people money and they decide for themselves what they do with it. And it has turned out, I'm just
I've been
recalculating some of the examples that you gave in your book, that as soon as the people get the money that they need, they are much more, they know much better what they need and how they want to deal with that money. It's not that they all just get drunk more or use drugs more or whatever is normally suspected, but usually most of them have a better life. That what all of us would consider a better life afterwards. And it goes along with saving a lot of money that society doesn't have to pay in terms of, healthcare, police, and all that. I think that's a very important.
Could I add one point? Because I'm really curious what you guys think of this. Because researching this subject, like homelessness and poverty, it sort of made me realize that so often, like, educated people have this complexity bias, where they think that by definition, big problems like poverty, like homelessness also require complex solutions, right? And so then you have this whole class of educated people who are sort of trained to make things more complicated. And then things are really complicated and then say, well, you can hire me because I can manage all this complexity, right? This is what happens so often. And then someone comes along, why don't we just solve the problem in a poverty and just, people don't have money, give people money. And then, no, that doesn't work like that. This is so complex. You don't really get it. It's like what I call the complexity bias. We so often, we see big but relatively simple problems. We want to make it way too complex.
Armon Rezai.
I do want to change tack. So if Miriam wants to say something, I talk to Rutger, and I would suggest she does it. The only thing I want to say to this discussion is I agree that homeless people, the definition of a homeless person is that they don't have a home. Mm-hmm. I would caution against saying they just need money, because I think it's also, there are a lot of other problems associated. Not always, but sometimes. And that, especially in San Francisco, where I spend a lot of time, is that you see that what comes with it, or which sometimes goes hand in hand with it, is also a mental health crisis that you see in San Francisco at the moment. I'm not generalizing this to any old problem of homelessness, but I think there also is, I think that not everything, Rutger likes to be a bit simplifying and saying that complex problems are not complex, or the solutions to complex problems, but maybe a little bit of the institutions that we have surrounding homelessness. And I'm not an expert in this, so I'm not knowing really what I'm talking about. But it just seems to me that maybe there are also ancillary services which might be needed.
Well, there you go. You're suffering from this bias.
Which would have been actually my point. Which would have been really my point, because I totally agree that this complexity bias is an issue. But my answer would be, this is exactly what the social welfare state is doing. Mm-hmm. That is what it does. It gives a basic minimum income to poor people. What are we seeing? It's being cut back. It's being made harder to exceed. In Austria, it's being decentralized. The counties are trying to push the people onto each other, which means everybody ends up going to Vienna, which is like the least trying to push them away. Mm-hmm. So we are not having the issue that we don't have a minimum basic income for people that need it, or a minimum basic pension, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is, and this is circling back with the original point that Professor Rezai was making, really what you're seeing is the political question, right? We have these. We have a basic minimum income in Austria. It's called Mindestsicherung, right? It's being destroyed and made harder and harder for people. Your means testing, I totally agree with you. It's been made harder and harder. What we need is political pushback on what's happening. It's going the wrong direction, and the question is how to get back to where we bolster and amplify the minimum basic income that we have. Mm-hmm. So, give money to the welfare state. By all means, tax heavily. But this is also not, a completely new utopian vision. This is something that we've been doing since the welfare state was established, and there was the original idea of it. So now change tracks.
Right, I'm going to change tack now, and I think we're kind of running towards the end of our session here. And I would like to come back to another point that I had with Rutger, and I think you just made that very clear, so I think it's good that it's a fitting opportunity now to do it. He said that, when people talk about things, then things change. If people maybe also get angry about things, then things change. And I agree that anger can be a very strong force for change. And I think Timothy would agree that anger can also be a very strong change in other directions. So I think a lot of the election of Donald Trump was attributed to telling people that it's okay that you're angry. You're upset with something, and it's okay that you're upset, and you should, because you're right in being upset, and I will change it for you. And so while Donald Trump was advocating for something completely different, he was looking back, as Timothy said before. Rutger is saying we should look forward, and there are things that we can go to which are a brighter future, utopia. And you should be upset that things are the way, because we can go to another place. It's a utopia which is achievable. So you should be upset that we're not there. Now the question is, how do we as a society get to consensus building? So the first question of my introductory statement, how do we achieve change? And then the question is, how do we can make sure that this change is something that most people agree to? And Rutger is writing in his book about shocking people. There's something called cognitive bias, and the best way to get people to acknowledge something, and I think the climate crisis is one of these things, you need to shock them and tell them, wake up. You want to shake them and say, you're not real. You have to wake up. We're in a reality which is very different. Now, that's very good in a certain way, because the status quo has a strong pull. We don't like to change things. I've always done things a certain way. I don't want to change it just now because I've done it for 20 years. I like driving my car. But on the other hand, we also need to make sure that it's a consensual agreement in a society. So how do you, my question is, there are two sirens, like in the old Greek mythology. One, and you don't want to tip into either. You need to have a narrow way. You don't want to fall back. If you're not waking people up enough, we're going back to the status quo. If we're waking them up enough and we're following what Rutger said, don't listen to the news. It's all wrong anyway. Go into your own little bubble. Then we might end up in a world where everybody is upset in their own way, but we're not able to come together and say, how do we change it now as a society? What is it really that we want? And that's why I also applaud you to the book, and because you say, we need to think about what we do as a society and where we want to be, and we should have this conversation. But the question is, how are we going to have this conversation such that everybody can agree to it and everybody's part of the conversation?
Timothy Snyder, what would you say to that? That would have been my next question to you.
I want to try to take a stab at both of these at the same time, because I think there is something which is even simpler than anything that we've been talking about, which is, in some way, is the beginning, I think, of an answer to your question, which is that we can't do any of this without an idea of what's good.
Yeah.
And when there is when ethics goes out of the conversation, it becomes literally impossible to find common ground, because common ground can only be achieved when I know what you think is good and you know what I think is good, and we try to juggle those two things. But when we're in an entirely quantified, digitalized, rhetorical, and moral landscape, when there's no notion of the good to play with anymore, it then becomes very hard. And so the argument that you make entirely persuasively for the welfare state is ultimately an argument which is based on human dignity or human freedom. But if one can't use those words dignity and freedom to make these arguments, then all the utopias past and future hang in the air. And so I think the single most dangerous things that we've been talking about, and you mentioned this in connection with Alaska, is the defunding of the humanities and the defunding of public education and the concomitant confusion of my feelings with what is good. Right? I think that is the single simple thing that actually has to happen. We have to have a conversation about what is human dignity and what is human freedom, because the case ultimately for the welfare state or for basic income is a case which has to be made along the lines of, this is good for people. And here is what's good. And I mean, it moves, I think, towards what you're saying, because then I can say, it's not that I want to hurt somebody, it's that I want what's good for you. Right? I want your children to have better lives, and here's my notion of what good is.
What's your notion of what good is, Rutger?
Well, it's actually interesting. One of the things that I try to do in the book is to talk about, all fashionable or just good policies like strengthening the welfare state, but try to talk about them in a different way, right? I think so often the problem with the old left is that they only know the language of paternalism. It's like, you're sick, you're poor, but don't worry, I'm going to help you. Right? And what I try to do in this book is to use sometimes almost right-wing language, or language that we have come to associate with right-wing, right? So use the language of innovation and of progress and of freedom and of efficiency. It's just, poverty is inefficient. It's a waste of human capital. We can't afford it. And this is what psychologists, they call it moral reframing, right? Sort of having this exactly the same policy, but using a different kind of language to defend it. There's a really interesting American psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, where he argues that the problem with people on the left is that they just have a very one-sided language or morality in which they defend their ideas. They only talk about, say, caring for other people, a little bit about freedom, while people on the right, they also talk about, say, for example, the importance of tradition and of patriotism, and have a much more sort of diverse moral meal that they serve us, which is in the end, therefore, tastier. So that's one of the things that I try to do in the book, is to have a sort of a broader definition of what is good and what is important, even though I'm sometimes just talking about quite old ideas.
I think that unfortunately we have come to an end of that discussion, only for now, which is for certain. I thank you all very much for discussing those ideas here tonight. And let me maybe close with a quote from the person you put up with a picture on the slide first, John Maynard Keynes. He wrote, a little later than the essay you mentioned, in 1935, he wrote his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And from there, I'm taking that quote to maybe keep us thinking and discussing, not only for tonight. The quote goes, "The difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping from the old ones."
Das war die Ausgabe der Wiener Vorlesungen vom 3. Juni 2019, die unter dem Titel Utopien für Realisten im Musiktheater Mut in Wien stattgefunden hat. Wir bedanken uns bei den Wiener Vorlesungen für das Okay zu dieser Episode. Und ich verabschiede mich von allen, die uns auf UKW hören, im Freirad Tirol und auf Radio Agora in Kärnten. Der Falter bietet jede Woche Auseinandersetzungen zu aktuellen Fragen unserer Zeit. Wenn Sie keine Entwicklung verpassen wollen, ist ein Abonnement das Richtige. Ein Falter-Abo kann man auch im Internet bestellen. Das geht über die Internetadresse abo.falter.at. Auch diesen Podcast kann man abonnieren auf iTunes oder jeder anderen Plattform ist das möglich. Ein Podcast-Abo ist sogar gratis. Anna Goldenberg betreut die Technik, Ursula Winterauer hat die Signation gestaltet. Ich verabschiede mich bis zur nächsten Folge.
Sie hörten das Falterradio, den Podcast mit Reim und Löw.